Welcome to the studio review for chapter 30, which is React Part 2. For this studio, we're going to make a pin, like a Pinterest pin, and focus on conditional rendering and using map to create multiple instances of JSX by looping over some data. So we're going to have a little pin that is going to have star ratings for 0 to 5 stars, the ability to mimic this idea of save or saved buttons, and displaying a variety of different information about a recipe. There's also some CSS that has already been provided, and we will occasionally just add a class here and there to use what's been provided for us. So if you go to the React Exercises in Studios repo and go to the Part 2/studio directory, you will find the starter code. And you will want to make sure to run npm install so that the dependencies will be installed. Then when you take a look at app.jsx, you're going to see, this return information here in the app component with a bunch of these different components already set into place here, and some default values hard-coded here into a couple of things that have props here. So you might start by getting things up and running, and I can show you here if we were to go into the studio directory here, we can do npm start, and it gets up and running, and then we can go and take a look at this in the browser. And then we find, if we open up DevTools, there's nothing here. If you come over to the console, you see a bunch of errors. And so, there's something wrong here. So we can go over and look and see in the components that some of these are trying to return, data. And this one in particular is causing an issue because we're just trying to return the JSON directly. So if this is still the case at the time at which you are working on this, if it hasn't been fixed, then you can either comment this line out, or you can just say return null, and that will get rid of these errors. We can see here if we clear the console, the errors have gone away. And now you just see a whole bunch of stars, right? And those are coming from the rate a recipe thing here, where there's an array of stars, different numbers of stars, and it's just returning the entire array and essentially stringifying it. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. So same thing here, we can return null until we're ready to actually return what's meant to be there. And now we have a perfectly functioning app with no errors, and we can move forward. So the very first part here, part 1, is to use this component we were just looking at, rate a recipe. They want to be able to return stars. And we can already see, if we come over and look at app.jsx here, that this component is intended to take a prop called rating. So what we can do is, there's a couple ways we could do this. One is to do props and then just refer to props.rating. You could also destructure it and just say rating like this by pulling that out of the props object. So it's entirely up to you. I'm going to go with props for now, just because they've given you some code here to use, and it refers to it, using dot notation from the props object. So we're just going to go with that. So they want us to add a second component. It's really a secondary component inside the main component. And if we copy this and come in here and just add this code right here, we can see now we've got another smaller component that's just meant to return whatever the rating is that's been passed in -1. The reason that they don't want us to just return this in this return statement for the entire rate a recipe component is because we're meant to do some conditional rendering here. So it says to create a ternary that checks the value of props. And if that number is between 1 and 5, then we're going to render give rating, this component, and we'll see that H3 with the stars, or we should render null. So let's change this to if props.rating is greater than 0. And if props.rating is less than 6, you could also do, less than or equal to 5. So we're asking the question, are both of those true? And if so, we will render give rating. And if not, we will render null. Okay. So over here in the browser, we can see that we have 4 stars, and that is because over in app.jsx here, that's the number that has been passed in 4. So we are good to go. We are only showing the number of stars that is at the index props.rating -1 within this array up here. And if we were to pass in a number like 0, then we see it disappears. If we pass in something like 7, we still don't see anything. We can test it by passing in 2, and then we see 2 stars, or passing in 5, and then we see 5 stars. So that is working exactly as it's supposed to. That was part 1. Part 2 is buttons. So this idea that we would either have a red button with the word save on it, or we would, the user might click that button and then it would switch to black with the word saved. Now, we aren't going to be dealing with actually having it switch them based on a click. We're not going to make it that interactive. We're just going to have an alert that is going to handle the click. Because we haven't really gotten into DOM events just yet. That's going to be in chapter 31. So we'll kind of do a little bit of hard coding in one place to test out which button gets shown. And then we're going to just use those alerts for testing the clicks. But we're not really going to put it all together at this stage. But the main thing that I want to point out here is we actually are going to use conditional rendering to decide which of these buttons gets displayed. And we're going to have a button component that's responsible just for displaying one or the other of these. And then the button component itself is the only one that's actually placed into the app. And they're using this prop here, save button, to say true or false to decide whether it's going to be the save button or the click button. So let's take a look at save button. It's already done for us. You can see here they've got a button, a button element, and it has an ID of save button, and it has a click handler, which again, we haven't talked about this just yet, but this is already done for you. So you can basically use this as a model for what you need to do for the clicked button. But it's essentially saying, okay, if you detect a click event, then this is the function I want you to execute when that happens. And that refers to this definition. And when this executes, we just see an alert coming up. So we should be able to test this. And because we don't have the button component completed yet, we can temporarily test it by just throwing the save button in here. And we should see it appear on the page, and we can click it and up comes that alert, right? You are saving this pen. We say, okay. So we can see that that works. I'm going to take it back out. So we've got the save button. What about the clicked button? If we come over here, we can see that we don't have anything being returned from this yet. What they would like us to do is to make it very much like saved, except it should display the text saved instead of save, and it should be black instead of red, and they already have a CSS class for that. So we're going to be able to do this very similarly and just make sure we apply the right class to this instead of save button. So I'm actually just going to copy the handler and also the return statement here to put inside the definition of the component itself. And then above here, we can copy the import statement for the CSS file, and then we'll have access to the class we need. So here we're going to change the ID to clicked button, and then we are going to change the text here to saved, and also we could change this to say something like this pin is no longer saved, so that once it's clicked on it, it's going to give you that little alert with the opposite message of the other button. So let's test this one out. We'll do this the same way. I'm just going to temporarily put it in here and say clicked button. And we already had the export statement down here, so no problem. And so now we should see this and we should be able to test clicking on it. And it says this pin is no longer saved. Okay, but you'll notice it's not changing back, right, to the red button. And again, we're not going to have that kind of functionality at this stage, but at least we are showing that we can use those individually. Now let's look at button itself. If we go in here, we see that there's nothing here just yet. But what they would like us to do is to handle using props, using the save button prop to decide whether we should display save button or clicked button. Currently, if we look here, we can see the save button is the name of the prop and it's true. One of the most direct ways to use that prop is to either say props and just say props.save button, or you can destructure it. So I'm just going to name it here and extract it from the props object directly, and now we have access to it. So I can return if save button is true, then we want to display save button. And notice as I did that, that it added the import statement up here. Or we can display clicked button, and same thing. I tabbed over so that it would automatically add that, and then I just completed the self-closing tag after I tabbed over. Okay, so now we have a ternary expression here to say if this is true, display save button. If it's not true, after the colon, then we'll display clicked button. So we can look now and see that our save button is displayed. If I go to app and manually change this to false, we see the saved button. So now it is definitely displaying the other one. So in the future, you're going to learn how it would be that you could make it to where when you click on something that's in one of the child components inside buttons, since this is the only place where we're actually placing these two. If we clicked on one of these and that click handler is actually defined, in here, how would we, communicate all the way here from the top whether this should be changed to true or false? And that's a topic for another day, to actually make it when you click on the button that it could then trigger this to change and show the other one instead. So for now, they've just hard coded this just so you can test out what it looks like to have each one on here. Okay, that was part 2. Part 3 deals with the recipe data itself. So they have added a file called recipe.json. It is over here in the same components folder. And I have already dropped some information in here. I went and looked up a recipe, stovetop mac and cheese, and I got it from a blogger, a food blogger, and it's got some information in here, the website, the recipe image, the author image, and an array of strings that is all of the ingredients. And so that's stored in the ingredients key. Notice that this object is inside an array. You could imagine potentially that you could have multiple pins in here, right? That would be displayed on the page. And so then you would have an array of multiple objects here. I'm going to show you eventually at the end of this video how you would change the way that this is done to accommodate something like that. But for now, we're just going to assume that this is all we're ever going to have, and that this entire application is just meant to display a single pin because they've already set it up that way. So we're only ever going to be working with the very first object of the array, and we can just refer to it at index 0 in this array, and we'll just go with that for now. So for every single one of these, the image, the ingredient list, and the author info, which they have different components for here, as you can see, they would like us to bring in the JSON inside each of these instead of just doing it once and passing them down as props. So I'm going to do it the way that they've done it here, the way they're asking you to do it here, where we actually bring in recipe.json in each of these components. And then later I'll show you how you would do it if you wanted to just bring in recipe.json in the parent and then pass down the relevant information to each of those components. So let's start with name. That's the very first one they want us to do here. Now, we had updated this before just to say, null here so that we wouldn't have any sort of issue with just trying to display, the recipe data directly. No problem. Now we're ready to actually do what we do want to do. They want the recipe name returned as an H1 level header. So we can do that. We can very easily just say, I want an H1, and inside this, I want to display recipe data at index 0, that object, dot recipe name. Actually, I think it's just dot name. Let's go look at the JSON to be sure. Open that back up. Yes, it's just name. So we want recipe data at index 1 to access this object dot name. And that's going to give us the information we want. And so now we see on here, we have a nice big H1 with stovetop mac and cheese. Good. Okay, next is the image. We're going to do this the same way. We're just going to use this import statement at the top so that we can access the URL to the image. Okay, and for this one, they would like us to use the image tag, and we can pass the recipe name for alt text. And then, of course, we need the URL to actually be the source. And there is some styling. So if we would like to import the styling file that they provided, we can set the class name equal to recipe image. And then they just want us to put this in a div. So I will do that. Let's come over here and start by, and actually, let me go ahead and make sure my import statement is here for the styling as well. Okay, good. So I can return a block of JSX here. Said that wanted it all in a div, so I'm going to start there. And then I will have an image with a source that is recipe data at index 0 dot recipe image and an alt text that is recipe data at index 0 dot name. And we also said we were going to add a class, right? So let me do class name equals, and then just give it recipe image as stated in the instructions. Okay, so we'll come over here and we have our image right on top. And you can see that it's, a nice small size compared to, the title and everything here. It's not too big on the page, which was, something that the styling helped with. Okay, so if I come here and inspect this, we can see that it's got the alt, with the name of it right there in the alt text. Stovetop mac and cheese. Okay. Let's come back over to the instructions and take a look here. Okay, ingredient lists. So this is going to be our first time really working with an array of strings where we are going to need to map over them to display the list items. They want an unordered list. So we can do that. Come over to ingredients. And here we will just return some JSX inside here, but first we're going to need to create it. So I'm going to say, we're going to need to import that recipe data like we did before. And then we will create a variable to hold all of the JSX that's created by the mapping. And I'm going to go to recipe data at index 0 dot ingredients. That's the array that's in our JSON. And then I'm going to map over it. And anytime you're mapping to create JSX with React, you're required to use a key. And if you look at the data in recipe.json, you'll see it doesn't have any sort of unique ID for each one. So what I'm going to do is take advantage of the fact that the built-in method map actually allows you to have a second parameter here called index. mean, you can call it anything you want, but it's going to be the index. And then we can access that and use that as the key. So I'll just return a list item with a key that's the index. And then the text of the list item will be the ingredient, which is just that string that's one of the strings in the array that as we're mapping through, and that's the other parameter here. So that should return that so that by the time it's done mapping over, it's going to have a series of these, one for each ingredient in the recipe. And then this, holds all of that JSX, and now we can use it below as part of this return statement. But they do tell us that they want this to be in a div, and it should also have an H3 in it with a header that says ingredients. So we will create the div, create the H3, says ingredients, and then below that, I can just go ahead and grab the ingredients JSX, put it in a placeholder, and it'll take all of the list items here that have been generated and put them here. Now, the one thing about this that I just realized, we really should have an unordered list here and place it inside that, because that's technically how list items are meant to be displayed with HTML, is either in a UL or an OL or something like that. So we'll create the unordered list and then put in all of the list items that were created up here. Okay, let's go take a look. Yeah, and there we have it. We've got a nice unordered list of bullet points with each one created separately as it mapped through. Okay, good. The last bit is the author info. We have a single component for 3 different pieces of information: the author's name, the author's image, and the URL to the recipe, so that you would know where to find it. And then we'll put all of them together in a div after we store the specific JSX that's needed for each of the 3 of those. So over in author info, we're going to start by creating, I have to get up, there we go. We'll import that recipe data, and we also are going to need to get the styling again here, so we can style the author photo and make sure it's not too big. Okay, I'm going to create some consts, and I'm just going to say I want these constants to be recipe author, and that's going to have a div, and we'll put the author's name in here. So I'll say recipe data at index 0.author. And then I'll have a second one, recipe author image. And this is going to be an image with a class name of author image. This is all in the instructions. They gave you this information. And the source for it will be the URL that's in the JSON. So I'll go to recipe data index 0.author image. And then do a self-closing tag for that. And then the third one is the URL. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to save the URL in a variable, because we're going to use it twice. Okay. And we'll say recipe website is going to be a link. So I'll use an A tag with an href that is the URL, but then also put the URL as the actual text that displays on the page between the anchor tags. Okay, so now I have all 3 of those. I can go and I can add exactly what they've given me here. So I'm just going to copy this and replace this here. And looks like all of the indenting is a little screwy here, but we're okay. Okay, so let's go take a look. And here we have it. We have a photo, the author's name, and the link to the original post, which you can see right here. Good. And I just closed my thing, and I didn't mean to. I meant to hit back. And this, boys and girls, is why when you do an anchor tag, it's a good idea to put target equals underscore blank. And that way, when you're going to click on something like this, it opens it in a new tab and you don't lose your application. See, I should have done that in the first place. That's okay. All right, so we have that. The only other thing I think that I might do here is add alt text to the image. It's always a good idea to think about accessibility. And so for that, I'm going to go to recipe data at index 0 and do the author's name, since that's who it is. And yeah, that should add that to it behind the scenes. Okay, we can always check that here using our element inspector. And yeah, you can see that the alt text there has been set to her name. Perfect. Okay. So we are in good shape. We've got everything that's supposed to be here, displaying. And that is the end of the studio. Now, something that I'm not doing as I'm going along that you should be doing is making commits as you complete each of these sections. I typically don't do that, take the time to do that because I am just trying to get through the solution, but make sure you're doing that. You're making multiple commits as you complete small parts before you get to the end. And then of course you can push your work up. I did mention that it would be interesting to look at how you would do this if you had multiple recipes, right? And you wanted to be able to have multiple pins on the page. Right now, the way we're doing this is bringing in the recipes to every single one of these minor components. And then we are getting the data we need and we're hard coding this, at index 0 here. So you can imagine that if we were to map over recipe data in here and produce, multiple versions of this, we would end up with multiple photos, multiple, images here, but instead of them being all separate in separate recipes, right, we would just have all of the photos from all recipes here and all of the names from all the recipes here and all of the author info from all of the recipes here, etc. And that's not really what we want. We would like, if we look at app.jsx, for this entire body here to be what's repeated. In order to do that, we actually would need then to bring in the data at this level and pass it down through props, and also loop over the recipe data and produce multiple instances of this code right here. So what I'm going to do to show you how this works is I'm going to create another directory here in part 2, and I'm just going to call it studio dash multiple dash pins. And I'm going to take everything that's inside here that we've just done all the way down to here and copy it to here so that we have an absolute copy of everything we just coded. And we're going to pick up where we left off. I'm going to close all of these. And we're going to start with our new copy here that is in the studio multiple pins. And I'm going to start making changes to this so that I have 2 separate solutions just in case you want to reference the original one later. So now that we have a copy of this, we can see that everything is as we left it. But let's say we go into recipe.json and we create multiple recipes. So I could come in and actually add some others. Let's say I do a comma here and then add 2 more recipes, cast iron steak and béarnaise sauce. We can have all 3 show up on the page in the correct order if we do this right. So right now we're still only seeing just this one on the page, right? Because we have hard-coded our components to only display from index 0 specifically, and also because in app.jsx, we only have 1 copy of this, and it's just everything has been hard-coded. So we need to fix that, right? The first thing we're going to need to do is to create some multiple instances of this code right here. So I'm going to import the recipe data here. And of course, it's in the components folder. So I need to actually go get it there. There we go. And now I can loop through, let's say const pins JSX is going to be recipe data. We're going to map through it. We will get each recipe and use an index to make sure we can add keys for each instance of this. And then return a whole bunch of JSX for every single one of the recipes. And then we'll have multiple copies. And it is going to look a little bit like this, but I'm going to put it in a div so that each of these can be separate. And that's where we'll add our key and just make it the index of whichever element it's looking at the time. And then we can take this and make a copy here. Put these in here. And down here, we can replace this with pins JSX. Okay. Now we're still seeing exactly what we saw before, and that's because we still have this other app served up, right? So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. I'm going to use Control-C in the terminal down here, and I'm going to move into Studio multiple pins and start it back up. So now we're starting up the app we're working on now instead of the other one. And we'll open this up. And we're going to see something interesting. We see 3 instances of stovetop mac and cheese, right? And that's because we still have this issue where everything has been hard-coded with the index 0, so that no matter how many times it's looping over and actually creating multiple instances of this, these are still only ever going to show the original recipe. We're not yet passing down information for each recipe. So we need to fix that, and we'll do it one at a time. So let's say for this one, we would like to have a prop called recipe image. We can do that. And we can pass down recipe from here, whichever recipe we're looking at from the recipe data dot recipe image. And then in recipe image .jsx, we will receive that prop, and I'm going to deconstruct it from props. And then here, all I have to do is say, we're not going to go to this data anymore. We're just going to pull it in as a prop. And we actually need a second prop, don't we? We need the name. So let's go back and add that as well. I can say the name is recipe.name. Okay, so we only have 2. I'm going to go ahead and do them separately like that. That's an instance of using multiple props. And so I can do the same thing here where I just destructure both of them, and then I can refer to this as name. Okay, so we're starting to see some things change, right? We have 3 different images now because I have dynamically allowed it to take whichever one of the recipes it was currently iterating over here and apply the recipe image and the name from that specific recipe each time. So the other ones, we need to do the same thing. So let's work on the recipe name so that we don't have a hard-coded stovetop mac and cheese from index 0 anymore. Oh, and the last thing I needed to do here was actually remove this import. We don't need recipe data imported here anymore because we are importing it in app and passing it down through props. Okay, so I will come up with, let's see, we're going to open up recipe name. We'll do the same thing here. We'll get rid of this and say we're just going to reference the name, and we'll bring it in like this, but it's saying, I don't know what name is, and that's correct. I did this the other way around this time, right? Where I made the changes to this without having actually provided the data here. So let's go ahead and fix that, and we'll just say recipe.name. Okay, and we see that we now have cast iron steak and béarnaise sauce. So this is working. Let's do the next one. We don't need to mess with rate a recipe or buttons, but we do want to change author info. So let's go over and do that. Now this one requires 3 different pieces of information, right? The author's name, the author image URL, and the website. So for this one, I think our best bet is really just to pass down the entire recipe object, and then we can just access them from that. So I'm going to come back to app, and let's just pass down the recipe. we'll just say recipe is recipe. So that the entire object will get passed down, and then inside here, we can grab the recipe out of the props object and then just say recipe.author, recipe.author image. And then for the alt text here, we'll do recipe.author again. And for the website, we'll say recipe.website, because everything is relative to what's been passed down through props. And now when we come down, we see Stephanie for the first one, but now we see Julia Moskin for the second one and Sam Sifton for the third one. Good. Okay, last one is the ingredients. We currently still have macaroni as the ingredients for all three of these. So let's go pass this down, and we will say ingredients is going to be recipe.ingredients, since that is the name of the key in each object. And then here we can destructure ingredients out of the props object. And then here we don't need to refer to this anymore. And so we can just map over those ingredients directly, and it should produce the exact same information. But now it's going to be specific to each recipe. So we have salt and steaks and black pepper here, and vinegar, shallots, black pepper, tarragon leaves, etc. for the béarnaise sauce. Perfect. Okay. So this is a very common pattern professionally that I have utilized for React, where we lift this pulling this information in, we lift it up to the top level and actually import the data here, and then pass down the specific data that's needed through props. And that way we can reuse this same code over and over again for different bits of information and have different results each time, but they're structured and styled exactly the same. Okay, so I think the only things that I failed to do is to remove these import statements after I refactored some of this. I think I did it in the others, right? Yeah, so we're good. So I hope that's been helpful, just to see another way to do this where you can actually make it work for multiple recipes, and hopefully that's helped you understand a little bit more about how props work too.